Welcome to my channel. This is Captain Binoy Varakil, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Joseph's College, Calicut, Kerala. This is in fact the lecture series on the Poetics of Aristotle, and we are in lecture number 7, and in this lecture we discuss chapters 21, 22, 23 and 24 of the Poetics, and chapters 21 and 22 are on Poetic Diction, and chapters 23 and 24 are on epic poetry. And now let's look at chapters 21 and 22, in which Aristotle speak about poetic diction. So Aristotle classifies Greek words in an esoteric discussion of simple and compound terms, and the reader can sift through a majority of this analysis and focus instead on his definition of a few key literary terms. So some literary terms are introduced in chapter 20, and in 21 Aristotle speaks about the poetic diction. So he tells us what should be the kind of words used in a tragedy. So he points out that the best poetry uses only current and proper words. This is meaning contemporary lexicon. This is very important. So Aristotle says that the best poetry uses only current and proper words, that is contemporary lexicon. When an author resorts to lofty or esoteric language, he alienates the reader. So no lofty, bombastic, esoteric language is welcome in tragedy. Indeed, a metaphor, says Aristotle, only truly works when it uses ordinary words. If one were to use strange or raised words for a metaphor or other literary device, it simply collapses into jargon. And yet Aristotle also permits the good poet to lengthen, contract, and alter words to fit his purpose. By playing with ordinary words, the poet creates distinct language, but at the same time ensures that the reader will maintain clarity. By playing with accepted or ordinary words, the poet can engage the reader at the highest level. One can think of Shakespeare here, and the way he so often uses recognizable words in extraordinary ways to achieve his rhythms and images. Now we move on to chapter 23, which is about epic poetry. In short, chapter 21 and 22, we have the points that the virtue of diction is clarity. Poets should use words of everyday use, not much unfamiliar usages in drama, and with contemporary lexicon and distinct language, the poet can engage the reader at highest level. And in 23, chapter number 23, Aristotle is defining an epic. He tells us the features of an epic, and he talks to us about different categories of epic, and at the end of the chapters he talks to us about the difference between tragedy and epic. So Aristotle now tells us that an epic employs a single meter, And an epic has a dramatic plot, it has unity, and all the other features of a tragedy. This is very important. So, an epic epic is narrated in a single meter. It has a dramatic plot, it has unity, and it has all the other features of a tragedy. As mentioned before, a proper epic maintains all the elements of a tragedy, since tragedy evolved from the epic form. So in the beginning we saw that tragedy evolved from the epic and comedy from the satire. An epic does not portray a single action, but rather a single period, thus often charting the course of many characters over the course of many events. And subsequently, epic poetry falls into the same categories as tragedy. So we have seen 4 types of tragedy, like the simple tragedy, simple or spectacular tragedy, the complex tragedy, the ethical tragedy, or the pathetic tragedy. Similarly, epic also falls into all these 4 categories. And also, like tragedy, it requires reversals and recognitions, scenes of suffering, and artistic thought and diction. There are a few differences between tragedy and epic, however. First, an epic poem, however, will not use song or spectacle to achieve its cathartic effect. Epic is just narration. Second, epics often cannot be presented at a single sitting, whereas tragedies are usually capable of being brought within a single view. Epic poetry, after all, is not confined to the stage, and thus many events and characters can be presented simultaneously because of its narrative form. Finally, the heroic measure or the heroic meter is of epic poetry in hexameter, whereas tragedy often uses other forms of meter to achieve the rhythms of different characters' speech. So this is again something very special about epic and tragedy. Epic poetry uses only the heroic meter or hexameter, whereas the tragedy, the poet can use different meters to, of course, suit to the different thoughts and speech of the characters. Now, Aristotle points out that the poet should take as little part as possible in the actual story of an epic, meaning limited first-person narration and no personal appearances in scenes if possible. At the same time, a wonderment created by absurdity, possible or irrational events for the purpose of indulging the reader's pleasure is allowed in an epic poem, even more so than in a tragedy. An absurd event or moment can pass more unnoticed in an epic poem simply because it is not being dramatized on stage. Aristotle notes that a tragic plot cannot have irrational parts. There may be likelihood, no matter how seemingly impossible the circumstances, as long as we trust that given the initial incident, the plot follows logically and probably, then the poet is in the realm of good drama. But if we believe neither the inciting incident nor the chain of events that follows, the poem is simply absurd and thus summarily dismissed. So, here Aristotle talks to us about the very aspects of the tragedy on one side, and of course epic poetry on the other side. And he is of course tackling the rather he just he has a lot of answers to he tells us very effectively the difference between, of course, epic poetry and tragedy. Now we come to the chapter number 25. In chapter 25, we have critical objections and their answers. And in this chapter, Aristotle is just resolving or answering critical difficulties. So the poet may face a lot of critical difficulties, and of course all these can be just resolved. So Aristotle names three major solutions for poets in attempting to imitate action and life. So the first major solution to imitate action and life is the poet must imitate either things as they are thought to be, or things as they ought to be. This is the first thing we have to remember. And number two, the poet must imitate in action and language. The latter must be current terms or metaphors, and occasionally rare words. Number three, errors come when the poet imitates incorrectly and thus destroys the essence of the poem, or when the poet accidentally makes an error, like a factual error, for instance, which does not ultimately sabotage the entire work. The only error that matters is one that touches the essential of the given work. For instance, not know that a hind has no horns is a less serious matter than to paint it inartistically. Critics often argue with a poet's work if it is seen as either impossible, irrational, morally hurtful, contradictory, or contrary to artistic correctness. Aristotle refutes all of these judgments by saying simply that it is the purpose, the essence of the work that matters, and its goal in imitating reality as it is thought to be, or as it ought to be. Okay, so with that, Aristotle is answering the critical objections and their answers, rather some of the difficulties the poet may encounter and how these difficulties can be resolved. And with that, we come to the end of lecture number 7, and now we move on to lecture number 8. So thanks a lot for listening. May God bless you.